Estelle Brooks stood silently at the boarding gate, clutching her boarding pass, her deep eyes gleaming with something both hard and tired. She was used to the scrutiny, the whispers that people thought she couldn't hear. But today, on this business-class flight, she had no intention of bowing her head. She wore a simple, pressed dark blue dress, and on her wrist was the same old watch her husband had worn for 30 years in the army. Her silver hair was pulled back into a bun, and there was a quiet pride in her eyes, a beauty that time could not obscure. The flight attendant checked her ticket, then nodded. She entered the cabin with the caution of someone who knew her every move was being watched. Unbeknownst to her, just a few rows behind her, a white couple had been staring at her from the moment she boarded. The woman raised an eyebrow, leaned over to whisper something to her husband, and he let out a low, sarcastic chuckle. "There must be some mistake," the woman said loud enough for the surrounding seats to hear. "She's in business class? Really?" Estelle turned her head. She had heard, and she knew the storm had just begun. Just seconds after Estelle sat down, adjusting the scarf her son had carefully folded into his bag before seeing her off at the airport, the flight attendant call bell rang from seat 3A. Madison, her blonde hair carefully curled and her expensive perfume trying to dispel any signs of everydayness, raised her hand, her eyes unable to hide her annoyance. Flight attendant Claire quickly approached, smiling professionally, but her face immediately stiffened as Madison tilted her head toward Estelle and said clearly, without any disguise, "Sorry, but I think there's been a mistake here. That woman, she came in from a different gate, and I'm sure this isn't her compartment." The air froze for a moment. Some passengers raised their heads, others quickly lowered their eyes, as if they weren't looking, the incident wouldn't exist. Only Estelle remained seated, her hands clasped in her lap as if she were holding something very fragile. Then, very slowly, she opened her bag, zipping it up with the care of someone who treasured the smallest things as if they were her own. The ticket was taken out with a slightly shaking hand, not necessarily from age, but from the familiar tremor of doubt she had endured all her life. Estelle didn't raise her head, her gaze cast down, averting it as an unconscious reflex, a habit ingrained by decades of being made to feel inadequate. "The tickets were ordered by my son." Her voice was thin as a thread, trembling but not breaking. "He said I should sit where I deserved to today." At that moment, the air seemed to slow. Claire took the ticket, glanced at the information, and nodded. Business class. Right name, right seat, everything was right, but Madison was not to be dismissed. She leaned forward, her voice low but full of thorns. "Miss, I came from the main gate. I know very well where she comes from. Maybe you should check again. The name or something might not match." Estelle still did not look up, but in that downcast gaze, there was something that was quietly changing, as if after each time she was doubted, the only thing that kept her standing was the memory of her son's words. "Mother, today you sit where you deserve to be. Not because you are my mother, but because you are the kindest woman I have ever known." Claire stands awkwardly between two fires, the arrogance of a powerful passenger and the dignified silence of a mother reminding herself to keep her faith. And then, with just one more look from Madison, the tension in the cabin suddenly tightened another notch. Estelle did not reply. She did not turn to Madison. She did not explain, did not try to justify or appease. All she did was raise her left hand to her chest, gently squeezing the silver necklace that had tarnished with age and holding it in her palm like someone holding a memory so fragile, afraid that if she took a deep breath she might drop it. The pendant was cold but familiar. It wasn't an expensive piece of jewelry. It was just a small, hollow heart containing a faded photograph. A black boy of about 7, his face streaked with tears, his arms clutching a backpack that was ripped at the bottom. In the photo, the boy's eyes seemed to be telling his mother something unspoken, but Estelle knew better than anyone. It was her son's first day of public elementary school, and the first day the backpack had been ripped open by laughing white kids who said, "You don't deserve a new backpack." She did not cry that day, at least not in front of her son. She simply bent down to pick up the pieces of the book, sewed the bottom of the bag back together with blue thread, and hugged her son tightly when she got home. But the tear in the bag, like the tear in her heart, never healed completely. And it was that memory, that moment of helplessness and pain, that taught Estelle one thing. Sometimes, survival is not through resistance, but through the silence of someone who has gone through too many wars that no one but them sees. Today, being doubted, criticized, having every move scrutinized, she doesn't feel strange. Nor does it hurt too much. Because this, for someone like her, is not the first time. But there is one difference. Today she sits here not because of luck or coincidence, but because her son, the boy in the old photo from years ago, is now a grown man, rising step by step, making the world look back. He personally booked a business-class ticket for his mother, not to prove anything to anyone, but simply to let his mother know, "Mom, I haven't forgotten, and today the world must see you as I have always seen you, worthy, noble, and not needing anyone's permission to hold your head high." And while Madison continued to talk, while Claire was still confused by the two opposing pressures, Mrs. Estelle remained still, saying nothing, just tightening her necklace as if holding her daughter's words in her heart, as if reminding herself that silence is not defeat, but how those who have suffered learn to survive. Estelle's gasp barely dissipated into the air when Madison suddenly leaned forward in her chair, as if she could no longer bear it, and spoke louder, clearer, sharper. "Call security. I demand her identity be verified immediately." The word security cut through the cabin like a knife. It made some of the passengers in front turn around, while others quietly lowered their headphones, as if they had just noticed something that had suddenly turned the flight into a cold, unforeseen zone. Flight attendant Claire was slightly startled. She glanced at her colleague behind her, seeking support, then leaned slightly towards Estelle, lowering her voice as if to maintain the peace, but her eyes still couldn't hide the confusion and concern. "Ma'am, could I check your ticket again?" Estelle did not flinch. Nor did she appear offended. She simply opened the worn-edge cloth bag, unzipping it slowly, like someone who had repeatedly had to provide proof of something that should not need to be proven. The ticket was folded flat, placed in the middle of the bag, just below the small bottle of medicine, and a piece of paper with the departure time written in her son's familiar slanted handwriting. She handed over the tickets without a word, and at the same time she smiled slightly. It was neither bitter nor provocative. It was the smile of someone who had seen this happen too many times to be surprised. It was as if she were whispering to herself, "Here we go again. Same old script, different actors." The smile didn't last long, but it was enough to make a middle-aged passenger across the aisle speechless. The man, who had been glued to his phone since the beginning of the flight, couldn't continue reading another line, because Estelle's eyes, even though they were lowered, still seemed to carry the question stuck in her heart. How long must I prove myself worthy of every seat, every breath? Madison, meanwhile, had leaned back in her seat, arms folded like someone who had just done the right thing. But what she didn't know was that Estelle's smile, so slight it was almost invisible, was beginning to stir the hearts that had seemed frozen on this flight. Just as the flight attendant scanned the ticket in her hand, clear, valid, correct class, without a single mistake, the sound of the cabin door opening at the front of the cabin rang out, followed by a soft light that seemed to tear the atmosphere heavy with suspicion and prejudice in half. A man walked in. He was tall and trim in a charcoal gray suit, his boarding pass still in his pocket. But what made people look up immediately was not his neat appearance, but his eyes. A deep, piercing gaze, but not angry. The eyes of someone who had just entered a situation he was all too familiar with in his life. But this time, everything was different. He strode across the 2 rows of seats, his voice deep and clear, not loud but so decisive that all whispers seemed to be swallowed up. "I'm FBI agent Marcus Brooks. What's going on with my mother?" The statement was like a knock on a glass panel filled with pressure, not shattering, but enough to crack all the layers of prejudice that had been poured in since the beginning of the flight. Estelle remained seated, her hands no longer shaking but still clutching the necklace, out of habit, out of prayer. She didn't look up right away. It was only when Marcus came up and placed his hand lightly on her shoulder that she did, and the light in her eyes, awe, pride, gratitude, and suppressed pain, was the moment that silenced the entire cabin. No one said anything. Even Madison was speechless. The woman who had yelled security was now left standing in the heavy silence that turned to her like a mirror reflecting her own cruel insignificance. And it was then that it became clear. The reason Estelle sat still was not because she was weak. It was because she knew, through all her life, that sometimes true strength lies not in arguing back, but in the moment her son walked into the room, not to save her, but to prove to the world that a mother who had kept her head down all her life was worthy of being raised, calmly and proudly. Marcus didn't need to say another word to confirm his identity. He just quietly pulled out his wallet, opened a small compartment, and held out the card. The silver shield symbol gleamed in the soft light of the first-class cabin, sharp and unmistakable. But what made people hold their breath wasn't the identity displayed on the FBI card. It was the way he stood there, not raising his voice, not showing his authority, just looking straight at the woman who had loudly demanded to verify his mother like a misfit who shouldn't be there. "I have spent my life defending the rights of Americans," he said, his voice soft and firm, each word ringing in his mind, not a drop of anger, just quiet disappointment. "Unfortunately, today I have to defend my mother, from someone like you." The words were not a punch. They were a deep, silent cut that left a cold, stinging wound in the sternum of everyone in the cabin. Because they were not just the words of a son, they were the stark truth of a man who believed in justice enough to sacrifice his life to serve it, and was forced to use his own badge to protect his own flesh and blood from prejudice that had taken root on the highest deck of a business jet. No more words were spoken, no more pressing, no more accusations. There was only a long moment, when Marcus turned gently toward the chair and placed his hand on hers. No words, just a squeeze that was a heartbeat in unison, a way of saying, "You don't have to bow your head anymore. Never again." Estelle turned to look at him. Something seemed to melt in her eyes, not tears exactly, but the light of someone who had just seen what she had prayed for all her life. That one day her child would go far, far away, but still remember the way back, to sit down beside her, in a world that had kept them both bowed. The woman named Madison said nothing more. No more resistance, no more finger-pointing, no more cold accusations under the guise of suspicion. Only a very human silence, as one realizes that one's voice, once so loud, has suddenly become small amidst the steadfast presence of a son and his unspoken love for his mother. The cabin door opened. 2 airport agents entered. No rush, no escort. They just tilted their heads and whispered something to Madison, and she stood. No look around, no words, just clasped her small bag and walked slowly down the aisle, where all eyes were different. Those who had sat motionless, not knowing who to defend, who had bowed their heads in fear of trouble, now slowly looked up. Not to judge, but to witness. Some nodded silently to Marcus. Some looked at Estelle. Their eyes no longer filled with suspicion, but with a belated realization that this woman did not need anyone's permission to sit in the seat her beloved son had chosen for her. The cabin was quiet again, but a different quiet. No longer rippled with tension, but calm, as if someone had lit something very fragile, but very real. Marcus sat down on the chair, still holding his mother's hand. Estelle turned to look at him. There was something in that look that seemed to have been lifted, something that had haunted him all his life, finally put down. She spoke softly. Her voice was no higher than a breath, but it seemed as if everyone nearby could hear it, because the words were not just for her son. They were for everyone who had ever lived with their heads bowed. "All my life I have only wanted respect from you. Now you tell me, I deserve it too." And then she smiled. Not the smile of someone who has just won, but the smile of someone who has just returned to being himself. After a lifetime of having to walk lightly, speak softly, and apologize for his presence in a world that should have been fair long ago. This is not the end, but it was just the first door, opening a path that Mrs. Estelle, after many years of quietly walking on the sidelines, could finally enter as herself. It's the beginning of days when we no longer bow our heads, no longer have to give up our seats or our voices to those who think they deserve more. It's a start for people like her, who have lived their whole lives in silence because they thought they should. And who knows, it might also be the beginning for those who have been silent in the face of injustice to learn to stand up, even if it's just with a nod.